It's an enormous pleasure today to introduce Dr. Culum Brown. Culum is a professor at the School of Natural Sciences at Macquarie University in Sydney, where it's 9 in the morning and spring, hard for us to imagine here. He completed his PhD at the University of Queensland, did a postdoc at Cambridge, then got a faculty position in New Zealand. And I don't know if there were other steps, but now he's in Sydney. His research focus is fish cognition and behavior, and sometimes its application to fishery sciences. So he has over 150 publications, with almost all of them on this topic. They've been cited over 10,000 times. He has a magnificent H index of 54. He's edited the Blackwell scientific book, Fish Cognition and Behavior, and he's also an editor of the Journal of Fish Biology. So before I hand you over to him, and he'll be presenting the evidence for fish sentience, I want to acknowledge that all of Canada resides on the traditional unceded and territory lands of the First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples, and that the University of Guelph specifically is based on the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And if you're not Canadian and you're thinking, why does she always do this? These are so-called land acknowledgements, and they're a way to sort of recognize that colonization has orchestrated the mass displacement of First Nations, Inuit and Métis people from their ancestral lands. And because Australia has a similarly sort of dark colonial past, Culum's going to open with something similar, even though it's not the norm, I gather, for an online international talk, just to recognize the parallels between our countries. So Culum, over to you.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me, Georgia. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm always happy to talk about these sorts of topics. I will start with an acknowledgement to country. Many of you will have heard that we had a referendum trying to recognise the traditional custodians of the land recently, and it was shot down massively right across the entire country. Every single state voted against it except the Australian Capital Territory. So I'm sitting on the traditional lands of the Watamaligal clan of Darug Nation, and we recognise that these people whose cultures and customs have nurtured the land since time immemorial, we recognise and pay our respects to elders past and present. So leaving that little catastrophe behind, what I want to talk to you today is about fish cognition, sentience and welfare. We're going to try and tie all those two things together. But what I want to do first is talk briefly about the fact that people just have a really low expectation of fish intelligence. Certainly in lots of countries around the world, you have advertisements on TV and various other things that play on this idea that fishes have a 2-second memory. So there's a serious problem from a public relations perspective. And one of my favorite characters of any TV show is Dory. And the reason I like her so much is that it's apparent even to little kids that a fish could not possibly survive or get by in the real world if they didn't have at least a half-decent capacity for learning and memory. Of course, Dory suffers from short-term memory loss. She doesn't know who she is, where she's going, or what's going on at all. So even my little kids understand that notion that fish have poor learning and memory capacities is bordering on ridiculous. The contrast, which is a bit of a massive gap, I think, is that actually we've known for a really long time that fish are really smart, and just as smart as just about any land animal. They compare very well to rats and mice, and in certain contexts, even children and primates. And we've been writing about this for, gosh, a long time, almost 20 years, about expanding on how smart fish are. And here's just a list of some of the sorts of things that one might reasonably associate with intelligence. And certainly Georgia highlighted in her previous talk that some of these are probably associated with sentience, things like certain aspects of operant conditioning, social learning, perhaps even individual and self-recognition and these sorts of things. And not only have fish been shown to do all these things, in fact, fishes have been a model species for understanding how these things actually work. And there's good reason for that, because you can keep, 50 or 60 fish in an aquarium, whereas looking after rats and mice takes much, much more space. It's far cheaper to do this sort of work on fishes, and you can manipulate them in ways that you can't really do in other animals. So what I wanted to do is sort of start at the simple things, just to give you a flavour of the sorts of things that I've certainly done in the past and what others have done. And I wanted to start with classical conditioning. And one of the things I always think about human behaviour is that actually we like to think that we're sophisticated, but actually a lot of the stuff we do is based on simple mechanisms, including things like classical conditioning. And this is a really simple experiment. You can literally do this at home. This is actually the flashy from the back of my bicycle and a bit of electrical conduit that's stuck to the side of the tank with a bit of tape. And all we did was every time that light came on, some food was delivered down this tube, and the fish simply had to make that association. When the light comes on, they should approach the tube and they expect to find food. One of my students ran this experiment. She looked at captive, reared, and wild species of rainbow fish. And she simply recorded just shortly before the light came on where in the fish tank the fish were and how quickly they fed. And you can see it, the time it took them to feed here. This bright green line here is the wild fish. We've got two different populations of captive reared fish, and this is a really common phenomenon. Captive reared animals tend to be way less smart than wild animals. And the other thing that's interesting in this is that you can see that we did a morning and an afternoon feed. And in the afternoon, they're just simply less motivated to solve this task. And that's because they've had 12 hours overnight and they're far more hungry in the morning than they are in the afternoon. And that plays out in both groups of fishes. So they learned that pretty quickly, 5 or 6 days, thereabouts. How about operant conditioning? I could have chosen one of, hundreds. People have been studying operant conditioning in fishes since the 50s. This is one I just chose because it's fairly recent, but more to the point, it's fully automated, which I think is really cool. And basically, fish are given a choice of various objects. And in this particular task, their objective was to try to pick out a picture of a conspecific that was displayed on this screen versus a bunch of other objects. For some reason, I chose the picture with a calculator. But anyway, that's pretty random. And what they had to do is approach the appropriate the picture. In this case, they were trying to solve the task by selecting a conspecific, and there was a lever associated with that they had to press, and that would deliver a food reward from this automated system. And the whole thing was monitored by computers and run by computers. So you could literally set the fish up and it would do its thing. And I think what's really cool about this is that in just about every contrast that they examined, it took the fishes around 10 sessions to solve that task. But the ones that they struggled with, ironically, was telling the difference between a conspecific fish and a coral reef fish, which is a bit weird. And there'd be much that you could investigate further in terms of what's going on in terms of their recognition systems there. So operant conditioning, really common. In fact, we did it in sharks, even a more complicated task than this. When in a big enclosure, we brought sharks into a tidal lagoon. We set up an area. They had to approach that area. When they went into that area, a target appeared at the other end of the enclosure. They had to touch the target, get a food reward, which reset the whole thing. And that also pretty much ran itself. So classical conditioning, operant conditioning, there are hundreds and hundreds of papers on fishes. In terms of long-term memory, this is actually one of the experiments that I did during my honours year. And basically what we did here is we set up a model trawl apparatus in a really big aquarium. And there was an escape route in that trawl. And as the trawl moved down the aquarium, the fish just had to figure out where the escape route was. And you can see here that over a series of 5 trials, they learnt that pretty quickly. What was fascinating is that we put those fish aside back in their home tanks and tested them a year later, and they carried on as if it was this like 10 trials in a row, which was some of the first evidence of really, really strong long-term memory. There had been some work prior to this looking at hook avoidance behavior in fishes that suggested that some fishes remained shy of hooks for over a year. So my expectation is that they might be able to do this, but I was absolutely shocked by the fact that they basically performed perfectly. Next, slightly more complicated task. This is time-place learning, where the fish have to learn the location at a particular time. Previously, cichlids had been taught to go to one location at a particular time, and it took just 3 trials for them to figure that out. So we thought, well, that's too simple. So I had an honors student do this. They basically put a food reward at one end of the aquarium in the morning and a food reward at the other end of the aquarium in the evening. They looked to see how quickly they learnt that trial. The random one, it's unpredictable. So, of course, there's nothing to learn there. But you can see that after about 10 or 12 trials or thereabouts, so in about 6 days, they'd again learnt this location at a particular time. And birds, I believe, have managed 4 places at 4 times. I've never tried anything further with fishes. Fishes also live in really complex social groups, and they're kind of renowned for schooling, but sociality is a very important component of their lives. And this is a nice experiment showing that guppies can differentiate between and preferentially hang out with familiar individuals as opposed to strangers. In this experiment, they basically got a whole bunch of guppies that had never met before. They put them in an aquarium together, and every couple of days, they would test to see if they prefer to hang out with their new schoolmates or a totally random stranger. And you can see that by about 10 days or thereabouts, they had clear preferences for familiar individuals over strangers. And what's interesting about this is that if you put those fish back into their aquariums and then test them again 12 days later, they still showed a strong preference for familiar over unfamiliar. And in fact, another student came back and did another experiment, and they found that even after 5 weeks, they remembered the identity of these particular individuals. So there's really obvious advantages to hanging out with familiar individuals. Lots of experiments have shown that there are both anti-predator as well as foraging benefits. So there's clearly a good reason why fish might want to do this sort of thing. Perhaps a little bit more, well, I guess this got a lot of attention from the press. This is the mirror self-recognition test, which for a long time has kind of been a benchmark for sentience. And of course, when a fish solved it, everybody assumed that there was something wrong with this test. They couldn't believe that fish could be sentient. So obviously the test is broken. But I would argue that, in fact, the evidence for mirror self-recognition in these really cool cleaner fish is better than just about any other animal. There's been a number of studies, and the reason these studies are so rigorous is because they got smashed time and time again by people who just couldn't believe that a fish could be capable of solving this task. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, basically the idea is quite simple. You put a mark on the animal where it can only see that mark if it sees a mirror image of itself. And so when it looks in the mirror, it does some sort of self-directed behavior. In chimpanzees, the classic is you put the dot on their head, and they, instead of looking at the mirror and touching the mirror, they touch the dot on their head. In the fish's example, they orientated, as you can see with this bottom thing, they orientated repeatedly with the mirror so that they could see the mark, and they were trying to repeatedly rub that mark off. Whereas if there was no mirror present, or if they were Shan marked, these behaviors basically didn't happen. So I would argue that the evidence for self-recognition using the mirror task in fishes is very, very good. Of course, fishes can not only learn by themselves, they can learn socially, and this has been a big part of what I've been researching for many years. I spent 3 or 4 years in Cambridge looking at specifically social learning and culture in fishes. I'm still to this day writing reviews on fish learning and culture, social learning and culture. And the cool thing about social learning is that fishes can not only learn within a generation, but they can also learn across generations. And so you actually get these developments of cultural traditions due to social learning processes. When I went to Cambridge for the first time, I was working with Kevin Leyland, and he'd been messing around with guppies for a while. And I was like, let's do something serious and apply this to a fisheries case. So we went out and we bought some hatchery-reared salmonids. Here's some baby little salmonids down here. And what I wanted to do was teach them to recognize live prey, because hatchery fish are completely clueless when it comes to live prey. They've never seen them before. In fact, they tend to back away from them out of fright when they first come into contact. But what we did is we paired naive individuals on one side through a clear partition with an individual who had been pre-trained to recognize prey on the other side. And in the graph you can see here, it took just seconds for those pre-trained observers to attack the prey when it was provided. What is interesting is then if you look at the pink one here is where you can see they learn it very, very quickly. And this is the observer that is paired with a pre-trained demonstrator. It took them just 6 trials to totally figure this out. The red one is a single naive individual. It takes them a while, but they do eventually figure it out, but it's significantly slower than when you're paired with a demonstrator. And this is my favorite one. This is what happens when you put 2 naive individuals in this situation. And instead of getting positive feedback, you get negative feedback. And in fact, the fright response of one causes the other one to become scared, and they go into this sort of negative spiral. And it takes them forever to finally attack and eat the prey. We've also done transmission chain experiments, which try to mimic the sorts of things that might happen in the wild. The classic example is, the matriarchal societies in elephants, where most of the knowledge is held in the mother, and when she dies, it's passed on to the next person in line, or the next elephant in line, usually her daughter. And we did the similar sorts of things here in guppies. They simply had to randomly either go through a green door or a red door. And we again paired pre-trained demonstrators that were trained either to go through a red door or a green door with some naive observers. And then every day we took away one of those pre-trained individuals and replaced them with naive individuals. And you can see that by day 5, after all those original pre-trained individuals were gone, the population that we trained to follow the red door was still following the red door, and those that were trained to follow the green door were still following the green door. And in this case, it's completely arbitrary. Actually, the foraging patch is right in the middle of those 2 doors, so it actually makes no difference which way you go, one way or the other. And you can see, obviously, even 3 days later, there was still really strong preferences for the preferred route. You can see this in the wild as well. This is a great experiment done in the 80s. You would probably never get permission to do this anymore. But this is some French grunts on coral reefs, and they hang out during the day in their favorite hiding spots, usually amongst urchins. And as night approaches, they go out through these very distinct routes to their preferred foraging locations. These guys transplanted entire populations or groups from one location to another. And if they transplanted them and left some of the residents there, the transplanted followed the residents perfectly. If they completely removed the residents, of course, and the control condition, they just went off in a totally random trajectory and got lost. So there's some really nice examples of cultural traditions in the wild. And we now think that actually culture traditions, particularly in the context of migrations, might be very widespread and amongst a whole bunch of really important commercial fish species as well. Tool use. Everybody loves talking about tool use because we used to think humans were awesome at tool use and it was a really important part of our evolutionary history. It turns out that, well, loads of animals can do tool use now, and fish is no exception. There's 2 really well-known examples here. This is tool use in wrasses. I have a postdoc working in my lab at the moment looking at tool use in wrasses. So far, we've found about 27 different species of wrasse that can use ambles in the way that you can see here. It was recently shown on the documentary Blue Planet as well. And of course, the famous archerfish, which is using water as a tool to spit at insects that are above the surface of the water. So I think hopefully I've convinced you that fish can do some pretty cool things. They're reasonably smart. And some of those intelligent things that they do are arguably evidence for sentience. But what I want to try and do is wrap intelligence, sentience, and ethics all together. And I think this kind of mind the gap framework is a good one because, as I said before, there is a big gap between public perception of intelligence and the reality of intelligence in fishes. And that is really emphasized by the fact that people generally like to associate sentience with intelligent animals. Now, whether that's true or not, it's kind of by and by because it's the court of public opinion largely. But I really do think that there is a good link between intelligence and sentience for good reasons. And I think that obviously once you've decided that an animal is sentient, then obviously it follows that we should theoretically have some sort of moral obligation to look after those animals by developing ethics and welfare legislation. And of course, that legislation ultimately is brought in by governments who are voted in by us. So unless people believe that an animal is worthy of protection, then it's unlikely to happen. So why would we care about fishes and the welfare of fishes? Well, there's lots of reasons, because we actually interact with fishes in loads of different ways, and I would argue that all of them have big welfare implications. The first and probably the worst is commercial fishes, and the number of fish that are caught worldwide is in the trillions for human consumption. So it's a massive industry. It's worth billions of dollars. It's heavily subsidized by governments. It's one of the few remaining places where we actually extract protein from wild stocks. Of course, we've fished the daylights out of the ocean, and because most of those stocks are now failing, aquaculture has grown in its place. Aquaculture is one of the fastest growing industries, particularly in Southeast Asia. In fact, a couple of years ago, human consumption of fish protein actually is now dominated for the first time in human history by reared fishes. So aquaculture now provides more protein to people than wild capture fishes. Recreational fishing is also a huge industry. Loads of people partake in recreational fishing. It has a surprisingly strong political lobby associated with it as well. Fishes actually are the most common, the most numerous pet companion animal in the world. There are literally billions of goldfish and various other pet fish out there. In terms of scientific research, the numbers of animals used in scientific research, fishes are second only to rats and mice. Rodents are still picking in it, I would say, but that may not last forever, because increasingly zebrafish are being used and are replacing rodents in many medical facilities, at least. And if you're interested in biodiversity, in fact, there are more bony fishes. I'm not even talking about sharks and rays now. I'm talking about bony fishes. There are more species of bony fishes than all the other vertebrates combined, which certainly offers a challenge in terms of, coming to terms with their diversity. But I would say there are lots of opportunities there as well, because of the we could do loads and loads of great comparative studies. And that's one of the reasons why I like doing comparative cognition using fishes. I wanted to talk briefly about sentience. Obviously, Jonathan covered this in previous talks in great depth, but I guess suffice to say that for me, at least, sentience is really about this capacity to feel positive or negative emotions. I try to keep it simple. I don't want to get too sophisticated, but that for me is the key. Why is it important? Well, it's important from my perspective because I do like fish, to be fair to say. So I'm very keen to make sure that people treat them the right way. And obviously, this concept of sentience is foundational to animal welfare. And I think it's exciting that different countries are gradually starting to recognize that animals are sentient as part of their legislation. I don't really understand how the legislation could work at all if you don't recognize sentience, because none of it makes any sense unless you think that animals are sentient. Nonetheless, people are gradually starting to formally recognize that in legislation. So I kind of wanted to cut to the chase, and rather than talking about sentience broadly in fishes, I wanted to sort of couch it in this somewhat controversial topic of pain in fishes. And this, I wouldn't call it a conversation. It's not really a conversation. It's been ongoing for, I would say, at least 60 years. And I would say that those who are opposed to it, the skeptics, really haven't changed their tune in all that time. It's pretty much the same argument that's been rolled out over and over again. And if you were to ask me, do fish feel pain? That is, are they sentient? My answer to that fundamentally is yes. And the simple explanation is that the reason you and I feel pain in the way that we do is because we inherited nearly all of that, those mechanisms, the hardware from our fishy ancestor. Fundamentally, the trait is so important to the evolutionary history of vertebrates that it's highly conserved. And that's not surprising. I don't think it's surprising at all. Nociceptors, which were discovered in fish by Lynn Snedden. Actually, we were working in the same lab with Victoria Braithwaite at the time at the University of Edinburgh. She discovered and identified them in trout in about 2002, I would say. So we've known about nociceptors in fishes for a long time, but what is more surprising, I think, if you look at the evolutionary history of nociceptors, they date back to the annelids, and that's about 500 million years worth of evolution. So obviously nociceptors are really, really important to the evolutionary history of all animals, not just vertebrates. And the interesting thing about nociceptors, well, yes, they're responsible for that withdrawal reflex, but they also report to the brain. And I think that's really where the magic happens. I really don't like this artificial separation between nociception and pain. For me, it's an integrated process that should not be separated out. And we don't do it for any other sense. I don't understand why we would do it for pain. But one of the things we can do when we're trying to quantify pain in humans is we look at the various parts of the brain that lights up using usually MRI and various other fancy gizmos. And what is interesting, at least for me, is that when you do that, yes, sure, various parts of the cortex and various other parts of the brain do light up when you provide pain to humans, but there's a massive individual variation in much variation. We just don't know enough about it. And of course, if we can't do that in humans, one does wonder how we could ever quantify that in other animals. And I should say, incidentally, and I've got this picture of a goldfish stuck up there for a reason, it's not random. When people have put a fish into an MRI and provided painful stimuli, parts of their forebrains also light up. So there's quite good evidence that the brain is involved, and we have a reasonably good idea of which parts of the brains are involved, although there's a lot of variation. But I think, ever since the 60s, the skeptics have really, most of the skeptics are sponsored by the fishing industry, which is hardly surprising that they maintain this line. They've really come onto this idea that, the neocortex is involved in human pain. And if humans do it this way, every other animal has to do that way. But the catch-22 is you can only do it if you have a human cortex. And that, to me, is a semi-ridiculous argument. Apart from the fact that it's incredibly egocentric, it also completely ignores the evolutionary history of the vertebrate brain. It's born on a complete ignorance of how a fish brain works and all of the functions of the fish brains. And certainly, if you were throwing in the phenomenon of convergent evolution, it would throw a massive spanner into the works. And of course, it's quite likely that birds, for example, have lots of examples of convergent evolution in their brains, and that's why they can do some pretty sophisticated things in the way that they do. It would be true to say that the fish brain does develop during ontogeny differently to the rest of the vertebrate brains, but we've known for a very long time, well over 10 years, possibly longer, that in fact, if you look at where the various parts of the brain end up, not only all the parts there, they are all performing the same function. They just happen to be in a different location. And so I think we should not be fooled by this structure function discussion argument. It just doesn't hold water. And one of the analogies that I like to bring forth is this idea of vision, right? So vision, humans use their cortex, their visual cortex, to analyze visual information. And I think it would be bordering on the ridiculous to suggest that if an animal doesn't have a human-like cortex, then it can't see. It's exactly the same argument, except we're talking about a different sense here. And I think what we should recognize is that throughout the evolutionary history of the brain, the cortex has kind of stolen a lot of its functions from other parts of the brain. So the way our brain works is not reminiscent of how it used to work in our ancestors, and nor should we expect all animals to use the cortex when they don't have one. They're doing these sorts of functions elsewhere in their brain. Of course, visual information in a fish, for example, yes, part of the forebrain is involved, but actually most of it's happening in the optic lobe and to some extent in the cerebellum. So it's just the same sort of processing that's happening. And what I want to point out as well is that fishes fall for the same sort of optical illusions that humans do. The visual system is very, very similar. Of course, they have greater capacity for recognizing colors and those sorts of things than we do. Nonetheless, I mean, the short story is that our brain is actually not all that different from a fish brain, despite what people will tell you. And in fact, the functions seem to be pretty much the same. And in fact, all vertebrate brains are based on pretty much the same plan, and they perform pretty much the same functions. So we should not be hung up on these subtle differences that people often get stuck on. But what I really want to do is walk away from using the human brain as the sort of gold standard. I don't think there's any reason why we should be doing that. And I think we should rather think about what the evolutionary point, or what the basis of learning of pain and its function and its evolution is, and what's its primary function is to keep us safe from harm, right? And I think that there's kind of two components to that. We spoke briefly about these already. The first one is this withdrawal function, right? That's nociceptors reporting to the spinal cord. The spinal cord does its thing, and you get withdrawal. You're not even aware of what's going on when that happens. But more importantly, and I think the second component is arguably the more important, and that is that you have to have some sort of cognitive engagement with this, right? Because if you don't remember that object Y or context X is dangerous, and you have to stay away in future, it just wouldn't work, because having been burnt, you would literally turn around and walk straight back into the fire. If you have to learn about these things, and if you don't learn, then obviously that's going to have catastrophic consequences for your future fitness, i.e., you're going to go up in a ball of flames. And so it's really, really important. And I would argue that this pain, the emotional response of pain, is a really, really strong negative reinforcer. The whole idea of that being strong is that you do not forget that experience. In fact, some of these painful experiences are so bad that people get traumatized. You remember these things for a long time. So I think that's really important. And I also think it's important to recognize that this is where the cognitive capacity of animals is particularly important from an animal welfare perspective. Because if you have the capacity to learn and remember from the past and project that into the future, then you can anticipate that negative things are going to happen to you if you find yourself in the same sort of context again. And in fact, that happens time and time again. You see stress and anxiety in fishes and other animals when they find themselves in a particular place or context where bad things have happened in the past. And if you look around us, there's really nice evidence for the importance of the evolutionary significance of pain everywhere in nature. And I've just picked up some marine examples here because they're particularly pertinent to fishes. And one of the things that you can see on the screen here is that sticklebacks develop spines. And if those populations are from areas where there are lots of predators, they tend to have big spines. Daphnia, similarly, they have this amazing phenotypic plasticity. If you put a predator Q in the water, they develop these spikes and spines on their bodies. And the reason for this is that when predators bite down on a stickleback, for example, a pike, and that those dorsal spines go through the roof of the mouth of the pike, well, I can tell you that the look on the pike's face is quite spectacular, and they cannot get the stickleback out of their mouth fast enough. And there's some fantastic videos on YouTube where you can see these pikes thrashing to try and get the stickleback out of their mouths. Similarly, the sticklebacks will be trying to eat the Daphnia, and the same kind of thing happens to them. Of course, jellyfish, another nice example. If you've been swimming on the beaches in Australia during the summer, you inevitably get stung by a jellyfish. It hurts quite a lot. And the further north you go, the more it hurts. But these guys have stingers, right? And the reason they have stingers, well, they're not only catching prey, but they obviously they're acting as a significant deterrent to predators as well, particularly fishes. Fishes will mostly leave jellyfish alone. And in fact, Nemo uses this to his advantage. Actually, clownfishes have an extra thick layer of mucus that protects them from the stingers of anemones, whereas those stingers are a significant deterrent to other fishes. So clownfish are basically using the fact that stingers are painful and aversive, and they're hiding amongst them. So fish clearly have nociceptors. Their brain, I would argue, is very similar to ours, and there's evolutionary advantages, clear evolutionary advantages to being able to feel pain in the way that we do. And the next question really, I think, is do fishes have this capacity to respond emotionally or cognitively in a way that's similar to humans to potentially painful stimuli or painful stimuli? And I nearly always, when I talk about evolution, I come back to Darwin. And Darwin was just so far above his time, it's unreal. So in his book, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, he talks about the close connection between human emotions and their evolutionary precursors in animals. And what he proposed in that book is that emotions are adaptive. They serve not only to motivate behavior, which we've mentioned briefly, they may also form as a mode of communicating your inner feelings, if you like, to outwardly express how you're feeling. And ultimately, that's a problem with sentience in that all these feelings are private, right? And unless you have a way of expressing them, nobody has the faintest idea whether you should be walking on eggshells or you should be excited and flamboyant when you're interacting with somebody. Now, fortunately, we can usually tell, even without verbal communication, how somebody's feeling and what their emotional states are. So, how about fish emotions? Well, we heard from Jonathan that at the most fundamental level, emotions guide behavior by motivating, rewarding behavior, by discouraging behavior that results in negative consequences for animals. Objects and contexts around the world vary in emotional salience and valiance. And more importantly, they're edited by experiences. So what's negative to you may not necessarily be negative to me. So it can be a little bit unpredictable, even at the individual level. And in this way, emotions really guide animals through the complex world that we live in. And it has to be that way because the world is a complex and ever-changing place. It is unpredictable to some degree by its very nature. And from a neurophysiological perspective, fishes actually have the functional equivalents of the dopaminergic nervous systems and others that are linked to emotions. They're fundamentally the same as ours with a couple of little tweaks. In fact, well, ours are the ones that are tweaked. Obviously, theirs are probably the original. They also have particular parts of their brains that deal with emotional context. For example, the medial pallium processes negative emotional memory, and we've known that for more than 15 years. So we know that fishes not only have emotions, but we know exactly which parts of the brain are responsible for processing them. And one of the things that, as a person who's interested in cognition, that excites me about this is that emotions actually affect the way we interact with the world. They affect our perception, our decision-making processes, and these have been labeled cognitive bias. And so pessimists, of course, will look at half a glass of water and say, "Yay, it's did I say pessimist? I can't remember. Pessimists will look at it and say, half a glass of water, bummer, I really wanted a full glass of water." Whereas an optimist will have the opposite perspective. It's still half a glass of water, and they'll be like, sweet, half a glass of water. So the study of cognitive bias really provides a window into an animal's private lives that tells us a little bit about their feelings. And I think increasingly people who work in the welfare field are starting to use this as a tool, as a way to look inside the minds and feelings of animals. One of the things that people have been using is this sort of judgment bias test, which is it's a relatively simple thing to do. It's been rarely done in fish, but it is increasingly used in farm animals in particular. And effectively, what you do is you train an animal to have a positive association with one particular cue. In this case, I've just highlighted it's going to be a blue circle, and negative associations with yellow. And you train them until they reach criteria so that they've clearly made these associations. And then you give them an ambiguous cue. And how they respond to that ambiguous cue gives you insight into whether they're pessimistic. So an optimist will approach it expecting a reward. A pessimist will avoid it expecting punishment. And it's been shown time and time again in a wide range of animals that those animals suffering from poor welfare tend to fail this task. They tend to be pessimistic in terms of how they approach this task. A recent study in zebrafish, for example, found that various forms of environmental enrichment for old zebrafish, they're usually kept in a plastic container with nothing other than their conspecifics. So they found that fish that are offered various forms of environmental enrichment, it changes how they respond to this test. And one of my PhD students has also found out that the sex as well as the personality of sticklebacks also changes how they respond to this test, whether they have an optimistic or a pessimistic outlook. So I think we're in a position now we can actually use this to provide a window into the minds of animals. So studying cognitive bias is certainly one way we can get access to the inner feelings, the private feelings, and this is a fundamental problem with other minds, right? You don't really know what's going on in anyone's mind at any one time. And it doesn't matter if it's your pet dog, your pet goldfish, or your best friend. Hopefully you have some idea what's going on with your best friend. But one of the interesting things is that, even today, if you go to a hospital, say you sprained your wrist or something, the first thing they do in triage is they ask you, how does that feel on a scale of 1 to 10? And that's about as complicated as it ever gets. That's what they do. So it's not very complicated. But unlike adult humans, certainly young kids, they simply haven't had enough experience with pain and to recognize what's real pain and what's not likely to kill them. Some young kids, of course, are so they can't verbally respond or they don't even understand the question. Of course, babies can't do that at all, and of course, pets and other animals can't respond verbally. But what you can do is have a look at the signs and symptoms of pain. And anybody who's ever done a first aid kit, one of the first things they teach you is to look for signs and symptoms, right? The person might be verbally non-responsive, but you can still see if they're likely to be suffering from pain. And some examples in kids and animals that are in pain, they might be socially withdrawn. Maybe they be more aggressive than they usually are. Obviously, their breathing rate would be going up. They might be less active. They might be trying to protect their wounded area. They might be distracted or conflicted and unable to concentrate, and so on and so forth. There's a load of signs and symptoms that one could rely on that, and many of them are behavioral, that you could determine that an animal or a young child is suffering from pain. There are many, many lists of the various criteria, and this is just one of mine. It's adapted from Walter's 2018. But one of the things you'll see is that many of the criteria are sort of neurological or physiological in terms of the evidence. But there are many, many examples of behavior which you can just see and you can quantify. So these things are relatively easy. And the main thing, what I really wanted you to point out from this slide, is that the evidence for fishes in terms of all these criteria is just as good as it is for mammals. And part of the reason for that is that there's more than 2,000 published studies on pain in fishes to date. So we know quite a lot about fishes, and I think that comes back to this ongoing argument that's been happening for 60 or more years. But what I wanted to draw your attention to are these really cool behaviors at the bottom of the list. These ones that are highlighted with asterisks are clearly complex cognitive processing of painful stimuli. So there's sophisticated learning going on here. And more to the point, it's mostly flexible, value-guided decision-making. And we'll illustrate how some of these criteria look in the real world. I wanted to start with some early work with Sneddon. So shortly after Lynn discovered nociceptors in trout, she did a very, very simple experiment, and she looked to see if fish would go off their food if they were suffering from pain. So in this case, pain is overriding foraging behavior, which is what a normal animal would be doing if you offered them food. It's a very simple setup. There's a control fish that was simply handled, and then we observed it, or she observed it. Actually, it was one of her students that did most of the work. Then there was a saline injection. Then she injected them with bee venom. And at the time, we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what that might be, what we should do to the fishes. And we decided everybody at some point has been stung by a bee. I cannot tell you how many times I've been stung by a bee. A lot. So people can kind of relate to that. Then you can also use a mild acetic acid injection, which is a little bit more scientific. But nonetheless, what you can see here is that the time to resume feeding is more than twice as high if the fish has been injected with bee venom or acid in and around the lips and the mouth. And I think that's really important, right? That's a fundamental change in behavior, and it's an important one because obviously animals would normally be feeding in these sorts of contexts. You can look at other sorts of changes in physiology and behavior, a percular beat rate, which is here. This is how quickly the fish is breathing. activity. And these ones are actually shown as a chain from background. So this is how different are they relative to controls. You can see when a fish is in pain, its activity levels drop. This is actually a little species specific. In fact, in some animals, in some fishes, if you inject them with painful stimuli, they go a little bit crazy and their activity rate goes up. But in trout, it generally declines. They tend to sit on the bottom and do some really weird rocking behaviors and things like that. So their activity rate goes down. And also, unsurprisingly, when they're in pain, their breathing rate goes up, which is pretty much what you'd expect. We've done some similar experiments that show that heart rate goes up as well. And there's a bunch of different potential painkillers that they were exposed to. But the one that really started to rescue normal behavior was the local lidocaine at the location of the injection. So that to me is pretty good evidence, right? The behavior is changing. It's rescued by the application of painkillers, particularly a local. That to me, there are nociceptive components to that. There's absolutely no doubt. But when you get to these more sophisticated behaviors where animals are making complicated trade-offs, then there can be no doubt that we're talking about cognitive and emotional engagement. And some of my favorite studies basically use this setup that you can see in front of you. Basically, you put a poor old fish in this experimental setup. If they go into this area, they may or may not get zapped by a little a few volts of electricity. Doesn't really hurt them, but they don't really enjoy it. And so, of course, that's a quite aversive stimuli. But then you ask a much more tricky question for them. If you have a conspecific on this side and or food on this side, well, now the fish has to make a decision because they're in a conflict situation, right? They want to spend time with their friends. They want to access the food, but they also know that if they do so, there's a pretty good chance that they're going to get zapped. So they have to decide, how badly do I want to access these other things? And so this is all about trade-offs. What's interesting is in the food context, initially, a fish will just stay away from that zapped area. But if you starve them for up to 3 days, then beyond 3 days of starvation, then they will accept zapping in order to get access to food, which is really nice because that obviously shows that their internal state is modifying their decision-making process. This is the data. It's a bit of a horrendogram for the case when there is a conspecific on the other side. And the key thing you need to know is that fishes really like hanging out with their fellow fishes. That is what they do. So the black line is when there's no fish there. This is the far side, the safe side, the middle area, kind of irrelevant, and the shock side. And the first thing you can see is that before stimulus, they're evenly distributed across the tank when there's no fish. After stimulus and during stimulus, they get away from that area as fast as possible. Hardly surprising, they're avoiding the negative stimulus. But what happens when they're in this conflict situation and there's a conspecific on the other side? Well, quite the opposite. You can see that before the stimulus is provided, they're hanging out with their mates and occasionally going off and exploring parts of the aquarium. During the stimulus, they don't change their behavior. And one of the reasons for that is when fish are scared, actually their need for companionship goes up because there's safety in numbers, schooling. That's basically what it's all about. And afterwards, they spend even more time there. So the stress and anxiety associated with being repeatedly shocked actually increases the value of getting access to the conspecific. So I think this is really, really compelling. Another one, which I think is rather nice, is another conflict situation. If you ask, and we've already talked about this to some extent, if you ask a fish, a normal fish, if you have a choice between a boring old environment where there's nothing going on or an enriched environment, most of the time, in most species, they'll choose this complex environment. It's far more attractive. But if you then have a fish that's suffering from pain, again, it might be an injection of acid or something, and you provide them with analgesic in the opposite side, then they actually self-administer. They avoid the previously preferred environment and they self-administer analgesia. So that gives you some idea of the value they place on trying to reduce the pain. And it's clearly more than would be the case for their preference for complex habitat. So I'm just going to quickly recap on that. Fish have nociceptors. We've known that for a long time. They show these changes in behavior, withdrawal, loss of appetite. When you expose them to painful stimuli, you see a similar change in physiology, heart rate, respiration, cortisol. This is to remind me that actually you can take a cortisol kit from the hospital and test the fish. It's the same thing. If you apply analgesia, whether it's morphine, some sort of opioid, or a local lidocaine, it returns behavior to normal, so you can rescue it. They avoid contexts or objects associated with pain, so they have this fear and anxiety. And more to the point, and they can anticipate it. So there's a psychological fear and anxiety that's associated with prior experiences, and they project forward in expectation that bad things are going to happen. And they also do this rather complicated trade-off with other needs. So I think it's, at least for me, it's pretty likely that fishes can feel pain. Their behavior and physiology is pretty much the same as us. They respond in almost exactly the same that you'd expect a person to respond. So what I want to leave you with then is what the implications might be from a welfare perspective. And given that fish are pretty smart, they're probably sentient, I think there's no doubt, but maybe some people need a little bit more convincing. They seem to be capable of suffering in the same way that the rest of the vertebrates are. How do we treat them then? And I would say, are any of these things the way to be treating animals that are potentially sentient? Here's some staggering statistics just for the number of fishes that are caught for human consumption by commercial fishing. These are just the numbers that are reported to the FAO. It's not unreported. It's not bycatch. It's not all the countries that don't report it all to the FAO. And the number is somewhere between 1 and 3 trillion. Conservatively, 1 and 3 trillion fish are killed every year for human consumption. And you can see the comparisons to birds and mammals. And so if you think about that in another way, about 405 fish are killed every year per person. And in fact, human consumption of fish protein is still going up exponentially, largely because of aquaculture. So the impact is somewhere between 53 and 1,000-fold greater than everything we see in the terrestrial meat production systems. And I think one of the ironies is that there was this very strong push, particularly in the 60s and 70s, and initially in the UK, to have animals protected by animal welfare legislation. But ironically, it stopped at the water's edge. And it's not entirely clear why that is. And that today, still remains the case in many countries around the world. My perspective is that we have now a pretty good understanding of fish cognition and physiology and behavior. We can recognize poor fish welfare when we see it, and we can do something about it. We're also in a position where we can actually start to provide positive welfare experiences for fishes, not just trying to avoid negative welfare experiences. There's an increasing call for the development of welfare standards for fishes, particularly in aquaculture. That is growing rapidly as we speak, particularly in Europe. I think we need to remember that there are more than 36,000 species of fish out there. So there is not going to be a one size fits all. All of those species have unique physiology and behavior. So even the indicators that you might be using are going to have to vary. Within aquaculture itself, there's between 250 and 300 different species that are farmed massively across the globe. So it's certainly a daunting task, but it's not one we should shy away from. So here's a quick summary. I've hopefully convinced you that fish are smart, that for me, at least, it's hard to imagine evolution ever occurring without this complicated association or capacity for pain perception. I think it's highly conserved across all vertebrates, and it has probably evolved well into the invertebrates. The neurons that are responsible for pain perception are clearly present in fishes. Brain have emotional responses, and the parts of the brain that are associated and process that information are present. They're clearly cognitively engaged with pain. I think I've argued that they're sentient. They show the expected behavioral and physiological responses to pain. Painkillers return to the behavior to normal. It rescues it. They do these trade-offs. It's clearly not a nociceptive reflex. They're doing far more complicated things than that. And I think we've got to the point now we can actually use our knowledge gathered over 20, 30 years to actually improve fish welfare. And that's it from me. Thanks.